Most people are told that a calm mind comes from solving everything that troubles them. But what if peace begins the moment you stop trying to solve yourself? There's a quiet kind of exhaustion that doesn't show on the face, only in the way the heart braces for one more wave. If you've ever lain awake replaying words you wish you could take back, you already know that feeling. This story begins there, in that invisible storm no one else seems to hear. It follows someone who looked fine from the outside, dependable, composed, even strong. Inside, though, his thoughts moved like restless water that refused to settle. He believed calm belonged to other people, those lucky few who somehow weren't haunted by noise. Until a small, unexpected encounter showed him something almost absurdly simple. That peace wasn't something you earned, but something you uncovered when you stopped gripping so tightly. If your mind has been running for so long that stillness feels unfamiliar, stay here a while. There is a gentle way back that doesn't require becoming someone new. No dramatic changes, no forcing silence, just a quiet shift that most people overlook. By the end of this story, you may notice a space inside you that wasn't there before. And once you notice it, you might begin to wonder how long it had been waiting. He had grown used to the quiet hum inside his head, like a machine that forgot how to power down. At night, while the city slept, his thoughts kept pacing the floor, replaying small embarrassments and imagined disasters. Sleep would visit briefly, then slip out again, as if even rest felt unwelcome there. He often wondered, in the dim blue light before dawn, how something invisible could feel so heavy. And somewhere in that question lived a softer one he barely dared to ask. Mornings weren't much kinder, just louder in a different way. Coffee steamed between his hands while his mind sprinted miles ahead of the day. A careless comment from yesterday, a meeting that might go wrong, a look someone gave him. It all tangled together. He smiled when spoken to, nodded at the right moments, played his part well enough. Still, it felt like carrying a glass jar filled with restless water that never stopped sloshing. He hadn't always been this way, or so he liked to believe. There was a time when silence felt like a friend instead of an empty room closing in. Now even peaceful places made him uneasy, as if calm were something fragile he might break. On particularly long nights, he would sit on the edge of his bed and hold that imaginary jar in both hands. It trembled whenever his chest tightened, as though it knew his secrets. No one around him seemed to notice the storm, which somehow made it lonelier. They saw a capable person, dependable, maybe a little quiet, nothing out of place. If they could have peeked inside, they might have stepped back in surprise at the noise. He sometimes wished the jar were real, just so he could set it down and prove it existed. Instead, he carried it everywhere, careful not to spill what couldn't be seen. One evening, after another day of polite smiles and silent exhaustion, he paused by a darkened window. His reflection looked composed, almost peaceful, which felt like a small betrayal. He pressed his palm lightly against the glass, as if checking whether he was still there. A thought drifted through, quiet but persistent. What if the noise wasn't coming from the world at all? The idea unsettled him enough that he didn't move for a long time. In the days that followed, that question lingered like a faint echo he couldn't quite place. He began to notice how tightly he held everything. Conversations, expectations, even passing worries. It was as if his hands had forgotten how to rest, always gripping the invisible jar to keep it from falling. Strangely, the tighter he held it, the more the water inside seemed to churn. He wondered, not for the first time, whether effort was part of the problem. One afternoon, while watching rain trace slow paths down a window, something softened in him. The drops didn't rush, didn't argue with gravity, didn't try to control where they landed. They simply moved, and in their unhurried way, they looked almost peaceful. He caught himself loosening his shoulders, just a little, as if copying their quiet surrender. For a brief moment, the jar in his mind felt lighter, though he didn't trust it to last. He had always believed peace was something you chased, like a train you had to catch before it left. So he ran faster inside his own head, rehearsing, predicting, bracing for impact. Yet the finish line never appeared, only more track stretching into the distance. It dawned on him, gently and without accusation, that maybe calm wasn't hiding ahead. Maybe it had been waiting for him to stop running long enough to notice. That evening he tried a small experiment, almost shy about it. He sat on the edge of his bed, placed both feet on the floor, and imagined setting the jar down beside him. Just for a minute, he told himself, nothing more ambitious than that. The water inside didn't settle right away. If anything, it swirled as if protesting the change. But he stayed there, hands resting on his knees, curious about what might happen next. When the minute passed, he picked the jar back up out of habit, surprised by a flicker of disappointment. Something in him had recognized the brief pause as a kind of relief, fragile but real. He couldn't explain why doing less had felt more helpful than trying harder ever did. It left him with a quiet suspicion that peace might be less about control and more about permission. And that possibility, tender and unsettling, nudged him toward a change he hadn't planned. From the outside, his life looked neatly arranged, like a room prepared for guests. He arrived on time, answered messages, remembered birthdays, said, "I'm fine," with convincing ease. People leaned on him because he seemed steady, someone who wouldn't crumble under pressure. What they didn't see was how every decision passed through a maze of second-guessing first. Even choosing what to say in a simple conversation could leave him quietly drained. Anxiety had a subtle way of guiding his days without announcing itself. He declined invitations he secretly wished he could accept, worried he'd say the wrong thing. A brief silence in a conversation felt like a judgment, even when it wasn't. At night he replayed these tiny moments as if they were courtroom evidence. The jar of restless water rarely stopped shaking long enough for him to rest. There were times he caught himself apologizing for things that required no apology at all. A stranger's impatience, a friend's distracted tone, a message left unanswered too long. Each small sting settled into the water, sending new ripples across its surface. He carried the weight quietly, afraid that naming it might make it heavier. Still, the strain began to show in the way his smile arrived a second too late. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon that held nothing dramatic. A careless remark from someone he respected landed harder than it should have. He laughed it off, of course, but something inside him didn't recover this time. In a quiet hallway, away from everyone, he pressed a hand to his chest and closed his eyes. The jar felt unbearably heavy, as though it might slip from his grasp at last. Standing there, he realized he couldn't keep living as if endurance were the same as peace. He was tired of bracing for storms that never fully passed, tired of measuring his worth by how well he hid the shaking water. For the first time, the idea of putting the jar down didn't feel impossible, just unfamiliar. And that unfamiliar thought stayed with him as he stepped back into the noise of the day. Not long after, the jar began to feel less imaginary and more like a quiet companion he couldn't dismiss. He pictured it clearly now. Smooth glass, cool to the touch, filled with water that never quite settled. Whenever his thoughts raced, tiny waves slapped against its sides, restless and insistent. When someone's tone turned sharp or distant, the water clouded as if stirred by an unseen hand. It amazed him how faithfully it mirrored what he tried so hard to hide. One morning, after waking from another fractured sleep, he imagined holding it up to the light. The water looked murky, carrying faint swirls like smoke trapped under glass. He realized he had been adding to it for years. Every swallowed word, every quiet humiliation. No wonder it had grown heavy enough to bow his shoulders. He wondered, with a trace of gentle humor, if there was a lid somewhere he'd forgotten to open. As the day unfolded, he started noticing how quickly the jar reacted. A rushed message from a colleague sent a sharp ripple through it. A stranger's impatient sigh made the water tremble, though nothing had been said aloud. It occurred to him that he wasn't just carrying the jar, he was constantly shaking it. The thought felt both unsettling and oddly freeing, like discovering a hidden lever. Later, sitting alone on a park bench, he placed his hands palm up on his knees. He imagined setting the jar between them, not gripping it, not pushing it away. For a moment, nothing changed. The water continued its quiet chaos. Then, almost shyly, the movement slowed, as if surprised by the stillness around it. He watched without interfering, unsure whether he was allowed to feel hopeful. A child's laughter drifted across the park, light and unburdened, and he felt something soften. He hadn't solved anything, hadn't become calm in any permanent sense, but he had seen the water pause, if only for a breath, and that felt like a small secret. He found himself wondering whether someone, somewhere, had learned how to keep it clear. The possibility lingered as the evening air cooled, quietly preparing him for a meeting he didn't expect. The meeting happened on a morning that seemed too ordinary to hold anything important. He had returned to the same park, drawn by a quiet he didn't fully trust yet. An older woman sat at the far end of the bench, hands folded around a cup that had long gone cold. There was nothing remarkable about her, except the way she seemed completely at ease with doing nothing. When he sat down, she glanced at him with a soft knowing that felt oddly comforting. For a while, they watched the trees move gently in the breeze without speaking. He became aware of the jar again, trembling in his imagined hands, louder than the rustling leaves. Without turning, she said, almost to the air, that some things grow heavier the more carefully we carry them. He blinked, unsure whether she was talking to him or simply remembering something aloud. Still, the words landed as if they had been meant for him all along. He found himself admitting, in a halting way, that he was tired of holding everything together. She listened without interrupting, her calm steady enough to lean on. When he mentioned the jar, awkwardly, half apologizing for how strange it sounded, she smiled. Not a surprised smile, not indulgent, just one of recognition. Then she said she had once carried a jar just like his, though hers had felt impossible to set down. There was no authority in her voice, no sense of instruction, only quiet companionship. She spoke of years spent trying to force the water still, shaking it in frustration when it refused. It wasn't effort that cleared it, she said gently, but the moment she stopped arguing with it, he noticed how still her hands were as she spoke, as if they had learned something he hadn't yet. For the first time, the idea that calm could be shared felt real. A breeze passed between them, cool and unhurried, and he realized he wasn't bracing against it. She rose slowly, as though trusting he would understand without needing more words. Before leaving, she tapped the bench lightly, the way someone might gesture toward a forgotten belonging. He looked down, half expecting to see the jar resting there, waiting to be noticed. Instead, he felt its weight shift in a new, unfamiliar way, as if something inside had begun to listen. He returned to the park the next morning with a quiet sense of anticipation he couldn't quite explain. The bench was empty at first, touched only by a pale stripe of sunlight. He sat anyway, placing his hands beside him as if leaving space for the jar to rest. When the woman arrived, she greeted him like someone continuing a conversation that had never really paused. There was a warmth in her presence that made the air feel less crowded. She asked him gently what he usually did when the water inside grew wild. He admitted he tried everything, distracting himself, arguing with his thoughts, pretending not to notice. She nodded, not in agreement but in understanding, as if she'd walked that same maze before. Then she said something that sounded almost too simple to matter. "The water clears," she told him, "when it's allowed to, not when it's forced." To show him, she placed her palm flat on the bench between them. "Imagine setting it down," she whispered, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the water. He hesitated, then pictured lowering the jar from his hands onto the wood. At first the surface inside churned even more, resentful of the movement. But she motioned for him to wait, her own stillness offering quiet reassurance. They sat without speaking, letting the moment stretch naturally. He noticed the sound of distant traffic, a bird hopping near their feet, his own breathing slowing. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the water's agitation softened. Cloudiness drifted downward, leaving clearer space near the top. He felt something loosen in his chest, as if permission had reached places effort never could. She smiled when she saw the change in his expression, though she hadn't seen the jar itself. "Patience isn't doing nothing," she said softly. "It's choosing not to interfere." The idea settled into him like a small stone finding its place at the bottom of a stream. For a moment he feared the clarity would vanish the second he picked the jar up again, and that quiet fear lingered, inviting him to discover what might happen next. In the days that followed, he didn't transform all at once, which somehow made the change feel more honest. Some mornings the jar felt lighter, the water almost clear before the day had a chance to disturb it. Other times it churned before he even opened his eyes, as if rehearsing old habits. He stopped judging the difference quite so harshly, remembering the woman's quiet patience. It became less about winning and more about noticing. He practiced in small, almost invisible ways no one else would have recognized. Waiting in line, he would imagine setting the jar down at his feet instead of clutching it. When criticism came, sharp and unexpected, he paused long enough to feel his breath return. The water still rippled, of course, but it no longer felt like a catastrophe. He even caught himself offering a faint, private smile at the familiar motion. There were setbacks that stung more than he cared to admit. A sleepless night could undo hours of calm, leaving the jar cloudy again by morning. Once, after a harsh conversation, he nearly convinced himself nothing had changed at all. But then he remembered to place his palm flat on the table, just as she had done. The simple gesture steadied him enough to keep trying. Gradually, moments of quiet began to appear where noise used to live. Walking home at dusk, he noticed the color of the sky instead of replaying the day. A memory surfaced without dragging a dozen others behind it. He discovered that stillness wasn't empty. It had texture, like soft fabric under his fingertips. The jar, resting lightly in his imagination, seemed content to be carried rather than gripped. One evening he realized he had gone several minutes without thinking about the jar at all. The absence startled him more than the anxiety ever had. He almost reached for it instinctively, then let his hands fall back to his sides. Somewhere inside, space had opened where tension used to sit, and in that unfamiliar space, a new kind of strength quietly began to grow. The real test came on a day that had no intention of being gentle. A sharp email arrived before he'd finished his first sip of coffee, its tone colder than necessary. His chest tightened on cue, the jar quivering as old reflexes rushed back to life. For a moment he hovered over the keyboard, ready to defend himself line by line. Then he remembered the bench, the still hand, the waiting. He pushed the chair back slightly and placed both feet on the floor. One slow breath in, one unhurried breath out. Nothing dramatic, just enough to pause the spiral. In his mind, he set the jar down beside the desk and let the water do whatever it needed to do. The urge to react softened, not gone, just less commanding than before. When he finally replied, his words felt steadier, as if they belonged to someone unhurried. Later that afternoon, a passing remark from a colleague brushed against an old insecurity. He felt the familiar sting, quick and precise, like touching a bruise you forgot you had. Instead of replaying it, he rested his hand lightly against his chest, a quiet anchor. The water trembled, then settled into small, manageable ripples. To his surprise, the moment passed without taking the rest of the day hostage. People began to notice something they couldn't quite name. He listened longer before speaking, as though he trusted silence to carry its share. His laughter came more easily, not forced, not delayed by inner negotiations. Even when disappointment visited, it didn't linger as long as it once had. The jar was still there, but it no longer defined the shape of his days. That evening, walking home through the soft hum of traffic and fading light, he felt almost unfamiliar to himself. Not fixed, not immune to worry, just less entangled in it. He wondered when the shift had become visible to others, since it had happened so quietly inside him. The thought brought a gentle warmth, like recognizing a path he hadn't realized he'd been walking, and with it came the sense that something simple might be worth sharing, if only he knew how. Not long after, he found himself back on the park bench, the place that had quietly changed everything. The evening air carried that soft stillness that makes even distant sounds feel gentle. He wondered how many others walked around with their own unseen jars, believing they were alone. If someone had told him earlier that relief could begin in a single minute, he might not have believed it. Now the idea felt almost too simple not to pass along. He imagined sitting beside a stranger and offering the smallest invitation. "Just sit still for a moment," he would say. "Nothing formal, nothing to achieve. Place your hands somewhere comfortable and notice the breath moving in and out. Picture the jar resting on the ground instead of in your grip. Let the water move however it wants, without trying to correct it." The practice didn't require silence or a perfect setting. It could happen in a parked car, a quiet hallway, even in a crowded room with eyes lowered. He had tried it in all those places, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with quiet relief. Each time, the same gentle surprise returned. The world didn't collapse when he paused. If anything, it seemed to soften around the edges. He smiled at the thought that peace might begin as an experiment rather than a promise. No pressure to succeed, no score to keep, just curiosity about what might happen. Even 30 seconds could loosen something that had been clenched for years. The jar didn't have to be emptied, fixed, or understood all at once. It only needed a place to rest, if only briefly. As the sky dimmed into evening, he felt a quiet wish forming for whoever might need it, that they would discover the same small doorway he almost missed, that they would realize calm wasn't distant or rare, just easily overlooked. He brushed his fingers lightly against the bench, a silent gesture of gratitude, and in that quiet, the story inside him leaned toward a deeper understanding still waiting ahead. In time, he stopped thinking of peace as something that might arrive from the outside. It felt less like a destination and more like uncovering something that had been there all along. The jar hadn't disappeared, nor had life become suddenly easy or predictable. Yet its weight no longer frightened him, because he knew he could set it down. That quiet knowledge moved through him like steady ground beneath uncertain steps. He began to see how his calm changed the space around him in subtle ways. Conversations slowed, tensions eased, even hurried people softened in his presence. It wasn't something he tried to do. It happened the way warmth spreads from a small fire. He realized that stillness isn't passive. It has a quiet strength of its own, and that strength seemed to reach farther than words ever had. Sometimes he would watch others rushing past, eyes clouded with the same invisible storm. He felt no urge to stop them or explain what he had learned. Everyone had their own moment, their own bench, their own hand resting at last. If anything, he simply carried his calm like a lantern, with no need to lift it high. Those who needed the light would notice it when they were ready. One evening, standing again by a window as he once had, he caught his reflection unguarded. There was a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there before, a kind of patient kindness. He pressed his palm lightly to the glass, not searching this time, just acknowledging. The noise inside had not vanished, but it no longer ruled the room. Behind it, a quiet presence waited, steady and unafraid. And as night settled gently over the city, he imagined the jar resting on a table nearby. Clear water, still enough to reflect the faint glow of distant lights. He understood then that peace had never asked him to chase it across impossible distances. It had only waited for him to stop running long enough to notice its reflection. The realization lingered like a calm horizon, opening into whatever came next.